Value and selection at Woolworth are a back-to-school tradition. Save now on a 48-function student calculator, just $13.99. Save 25% on Timex watches for the whole family. For the dorm, Easy Care polyester blankets are now 2 for $8, and a sturdy plywood frame footlocker just $15.88. Buy a heavy-duty canvas binder for only $3.99 and filler paper at 58 cents a pack. Shop now for back-to-school savings store-wide. It's a Woolworth tradition.
Woolworths, or the F.W. Woolworth Company, or Woolworth. It depends who you ask. I usually just say Woolworths, because it makes more sense to me, but you can call it whatever you want. But especially if you're an older person, you've probably heard of them before, as once they were one of the principal retailers in the United States, and in fact all over the world. And speaking of all over the world, some of you are probably gonna get really confused, because this seems like a downfall video, and it sort of is, but Woolworths is a weird story. Because they didn't necessarily fail. In fact, they're still around, as in the original company is still around, and in the United States. You probably just didn't even realize it. And for other countries, the name is still used, and still sees success, but depending on which country you're talking about, that context of the use of that name, and whether or not it even has anything to do with the original Woolworths, varies. So, I'm going to try my very best to clarify for most of my audience in terms of where you live, where your Woolworths might lie in terms of this story, but we're going to go all the way back and just talk about the original Woolworths Company before we get to what happened to them. Because if you're in the US, definitely, you don't see Woolworths anymore. Where'd they go? Did they go under? Did Walmart destroy them? Well, sort of, actually, in a way. It wasn't just Walmart, but it was a massive change in market. That's all that classic brands like Woolworths would no longer have a place, at least in America. Within the origin of Woolworths, we could find the origin of the 5 and dime stores. 5 and dime stores, or 5 and 10, or 5 and 10 cent stores, whatever you want to call them, are basically just really cheap stores. It's right there in the name. That was the whole point. They would focus on cheaper merchandise and just have a lot of it. And prior to Woolworths, it wasn't thought that an entire store could actually maintain itself with only low-price goods. But this concept would prove that thinking wrong, and Woolworths would pioneer a lot of the practices that we see in modern retailers like Walmart or Target. Not just the cheaper prices, although I wish things still cost 5 and 10 cents, that's not feasible anymore, but also they were one of the first American retailers to put merchandise out for the public to actually handle and touch and look at. Prior to this, classic store formats had customers always interact with the sales clerk, and they would tell them what they wanted, and the clerk would bring the item to them to look at. This was more time-consuming and cumbersome, and Woolworths realized, well, why don't we just let the customer look at it on the shelf? Well, what if they steal it? Okay, some people are going to, but as it turns out, most people, and I know I had to check the data on this, most people aren't horrible. This change in practice led to the concept of browsing. People would go to stores and actually look around to shop for stuff they didn't even know they wanted. Whereas before, they had to go to the clerk and they didn't always know what the store had, or even if it was worth buying. This simple switch-up completely changed how retail was handled. And Woolworths goes back so far. They are way older than any retail establishment I've talked about thus far, because their origins go back to 1879. Yes, they are that old. The founder, Frank Winfield Woolworth, started his career working at Augsbury and Moore dry goods store, which was located in Watertown, New York. He was a good employee, good enough that he was able to obtain a line of credit from his own boss, William Moore, along with his own savings, which he used to buy merchandise and open up his first store, Woolworth's Great 5-Cent Store, in Utica, New York, on February 22nd, 1879. The store failed. No, seriously, it was a complete failure. He failed horribly. It closed in just a few months in May. And it only lasted that long because Woolworth was waiting to earn just enough money so he could pay back more. But Woolworth was a stubborn man. He didn't want to give up. He really believed in his dream. So he made a second go at it, opening up another Woolworth's Great 5-cent store, using the exact same sign from the first one on June 21st, 1879, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Lancaster proved to be a much better location, as that store did really well, so well that he was able to open up a second store in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the same year. He even brought in his brother Charles as a manager, but that store closed due to issues with the landlord, so they opened up another store in York, PA, which also closed after only 3 months. They weren't doing so hot with the expansion at first, but Lancaster was still fine, and in 1880 they would open the 5-cent Woolworth Brothers store in Scranton, PA, with Charles as the manager again. At that location, the 5-cent and 10-cent merchandising model was fully implemented and understood, and as a result, the store was an instant success. After a couple years, Charles would become the first franchisee of the Woolworths chain when he bought out Frank's share of the Scranton store. And in 1884, Charles would partner with Fred Morgan Kirby to develop a location in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which was called Woolworth & Kirby. With the success of this store, Frank, Charles, as well as Fred started persuading their family members and associates to join them in what they called a friendly rival syndicate, which sounds both somewhat wholesome as well as somewhat sinister due to the use of the words friendly and syndicate. This syndicate of 5 and 10 cent stores was kind of the precursor to the overall chain, as well as a full unified front, because every single store looked rather similar. They just operated under their individual founders' names, so they were named differently, at least at first. Over the following decades, they started to grow. By 1904, they had 6 chains of stores, operating in both the US and Canada. And slowly, they started incorporating, separately at first, but in 1912, all 596 stores merged into a single corporate entity under the name F.W. Woolworth Company. Frank was president, and Charles, Fred, and the others were given roles like director and vice president. The company began to grow quite quickly, and slowly over time developed into more of a department store setup. They made so much money that in 1910, Frank commissioned the design and construction of the Woolworth Building in New York City, which still stands today. The store started incorporating things like lunch counters after the success of that particular concept over in the United Kingdom, as their first store under the name had a lunch counter and everyone loved it. It was amazing. You could shop and then eat something delicious, and the stores were a common sight all around the country. And in the 1950s and 60s, it was basically impossible not to find a shopping mall with a Woolworths in it. Although criticisms abounded of the company because of how large they were, people complained that they were driving these mom and pop shops out of business. How dare they? Even though they were also a small startup initially. So y'all think the complaints and whining about big business killing small businesses is new? It happens every time in every decade since the start of business, actually. In the 1960s, they were full-tilt department stores. Discount department stores, but still department stores. Nothing wrong with that, but that was also about the time that the concept of big box started becoming a thing. Companies like Kmart, Target, and Walmart suddenly appeared, and these new big box formats proved exceedingly popular, which was pretty threatening to Woolworth's rather large market share. As such, they followed along and founded their own single-floor discount store, known as Woolco. But Woolco didn't really do very well, all things considered. They were founded in 1962 and were defunct in the United States by 1983, 1986 in the UK, and 1994 in Canada. They just didn't catch on like the others did. And it was mostly down to their size. Woolworths decided that, well, if the big boxes are gonna be so big, we'll make ours bigger. And they did. A typical Woolco store was over 100,000 square feet, which sounds great, you could put a lot in that, but that was way too big for those days. Now, a large store like that would make a lot of sense and probably do pretty well, but back in the 1960s? No. No, that wasn't feasible. That wasn't reasonable. That wasn't going to work. And it meant the overhead costs of Woolco stores were way too high. They tried to shrink them down a bit over time to change their fortunes, but by that point their competition had solidified, so Woolco was out. The core business, though, was still there. Woolworth still existed. What was going on there? Well, in 1979 they had their 100th anniversary, and at the time, they were recorded in the Guinness Book of World Records as being the largest department store chain in the world. Awesome! It's all downhill from here, though. See, in the late 70s and 80s, it was about that time that specialty stores were really starting to catch on rather than general stores. And if you were a general store, you probably shouldn't be a department store. You should be a big box. Since Woolco hadn't turned out well, they weren't really comfortable with the idea of trying again with the general merchandise big box outlet, but they were looking into more specialty formats. They still had plenty of money just kicking around. They could afford to experiment, and they did. They founded several different brands and store formats, which included things like Afterthoughts, Northern Reflections, RX Place, and Champs Sports. As their core business model continued to decline into the 90s, they got way more aggressive with the specialty store formats, basically throwing everything at the wall until something stuck. They founded so many it's hard to keep track, as some failed almost instantly, and if it did, they would instantly replace it with a different one. This sounds like a really haphazard way of doing this, but understand that Woolworths had done a really good job of maintaining, well, their finances. Their bookkeeping was pretty solid. As such, like I said, they could afford to do it this way. They had a lot of money just sitting around, and that meant that in their situation they could utilize that money to try to find something that actually worked in the modern market. And they did eventually find it. Interestingly, it was actually right under their nose the whole time. In 1963, they had expanded into the shoe store business with the purchase of the Kinney Shoe Corporation. This would lead to them founding the sporting goods store Foot Locker in 1974. The one thing they noticed is that regardless of what format they were utilizing, if the place sold sporting goods, they sold really well. Even in the department stores, it seemed like the market really needed a place where you could do that, and Woolworths happened to be the best, but that alone wasn't going to prop up a whole department store. But it could prop up a specialty store. On October 15th, 1993, Woolworths began a restructuring plan that involved closing half of their over 800 department stores in the United States, as well as converting the Canadian stores to a new closeout division that they called the Bargain Shop. I don't know why they put that explanation point there, but that means it's not just the Bargain Shop. It's the Bargain Shop. And I don't like it. Woolco was still alive in Canada at this point, but in 1994, the majority of them were sold off to Walmart, when then converted into, well, Walmart. I don't know what you expected. The ones that weren't sold to Walmart were converted to the Bargain Shop, or sold over to Zellers, which was a Canadian discount store chain. A handful were just simply closed permanently. The restructuring plans didn't really save the core business, though. On March 17, 1997, Walmart replaced Woolworths as a component of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And you might think, alright, here comes the bankruptcy. How did they handle this? But, no. No, Woolworths didn't enter a bankruptcy. I know, that doesn't seem to make sense here, because, well, if they didn't enter a bankruptcy, then where do all the stores go? Well, as it turns out, and I know this is news to a lot of people, a company doesn't actually have to enter a bankruptcy to shut down their stores. You can shut down before you have to declare bankruptcy. And the thing about Woolworths is they were very well managed. Even though they couldn't compete in the modern day, they were good about reading the writing on the wall, and they knew their store format just could not be salvaged. There was nothing they can do. So, the best thing they could do is pull the plug. Just forget it, shut it down now, it's just draining their finances. They might as well. And that's exactly what they did. On July 17th, 1997, they announced that they would be closing all the remaining department stores that were located in the United States. And they changed their corporate name from Woolworths to Venator. Also, that didn't last very long. Though in 1999, they also left their historical home offices in the Woolworth building to smaller ones on 34th Street. So their stores are shut down. What are they going to do? Well, they were experimenting with specialty stores. And in the modern day, you probably have shopped with Woolworths, even in the United States. You just probably didn't even realize it. See, on October 20th, 2001, they changed their name again to a less sinister one. They took the name of their top retail performer, Foot Locker. Yep, like I said, they founded Foot Locker, and it probably dawned on some of you that Foot Locker is still around, because Foot Locker is Woolworths. Legally, they are the same exact company, just under a different name. They're a continuation of Woolworths. They retain all their stock price history. For all intents and purposes, Foot Locker is Woolworths. They simply found what worked in the United States, and for them, it was sporting goods and shoes. So they focused on what people were actually buying from them, and it worked out. They're still a successful company, they're still making a ton of money. They're not the big, fancy, gaudy department stores anymore, sure, but they don't have to be. They're still making money, they're still successful, and they're still in business. That's success. The story of Woolworths is mostly a lesson in when to call it quits. True, in the beginning, the only reason they existed at all is that their founder didn't give up. And that's good, but sometimes you kinda have to, especially when a corporation becomes so large that if they kept going, they were gonna implode catastrophically. Instead, they simply cut off the losing strategy and focused on what did actually work. And as a result, they're still around today, even if a lot of you didn't actually even realize it. But, as I said when I started this video, Woolworth's global presence is a little bit different and gets very, 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 very confusing. Because there are other Woolworths all over the world. The UK one did eventually go out of business. Mexico still has a few, though arguably the most successful version of the original company is over in Woolworth, Deutschland. Yeah, apparently Germany just really loves Woolworths. They're doing really well over there, even to this day. They separated from the original Woolworths back in 1998, and they were also the ones that purchased what was left of the British and Irish Woolworths when they went out of business. There's apparently at least one in Barbados that split from the British branch in 1982, and there's two others that are weird. These are Woolworths and Woolworths Group. Woolworths is South African, and it is not the same as the American one. It is an entirely separate thing. Though it was named after the American one, they were never tied in the business sense, and they still exist. And then there's Woolworths Group, which is the largest retail corporation in Australia. Also, not at all affiliated with the original Woolworths. The name was taken legally, mind you, because it wasn't trademarked in Australia, to capitalize on the Woolworths name because they were very famous. Woolworths Group is still incredibly successful. They have supermarkets all over the place in Australia, New Zealand, and they own other chains like Big W, Everyday Rewards, My Deal, and a handful of others. Since neither them nor the South African one are actually tied to the original Woolworth technically, I wasn't gonna bring them up, but then it dawned on me that my Australian and South African following would watch this video and get mad confused because they still have plenty of Woolworths. Your Woolworths is not our Woolworths. They're totally different things. You just stole the name. Legally, but just stole it. That's what you did. Regardless, you are welcome to go shop and enjoy yourself at your Woolworths. And for us, here in America, we'll go to Foot Locker. That's our Woolworths now. It's Foot Locker. And with that, a special thank you goes to all my underwater train finders. Some Dude 267, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Lord Off 444, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Kenneth Crosswhite, Josh Johnson, Kid of Brainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Delinsky, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding G, Wiz, Mr. Terevel, Hayden DeGrow, No, Kurt Forkham, Mr. Sleepy, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Liam Wright, Morris Tillman Productions, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Duraushi, A Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer 78, Shimasu, Eric Hutton, NJ 1969, Mental for Life Guy, Andrew Bowen, Crimson Rose, Ryan Weover, Jared Brussel, Zintac M, Boss K, Orange Glass, Andy, The Conceptualist, Acoletti, Ohio Trucker 1, Windy City Rails, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.